What's up, dude? How's summer for you, bro?
It's good, man. It's good. It's a very different summer, dude. Summer 2020 in general is a year I don't think anyone's going to ever forget. But like most people, I'm just trying to make the most of it, stay productive, stay healthy. But it's definitely a different environment to try to do that all in now.
For sure, man. I was at the beach yesterday and it like there was people there, but it definitely wasn't what you would expect, sitting here in the middle of July. It's definitely a unique time, but it's summertime and I all I know is that including all of the fun that you can have in summer, it's also one of those times where a lot of people are telling you what they're reading, they're sharing their book lists. A lot of people are trying to find new things to read right now. And so I know you and I, just based off of our friendship, we thoroughly enjoy reading. We talk about it all the time. And I thought that, we were discussing this together and we decided that we should just talk about reading, its impact on us, and, how people can benefit from it. And so it's just one of those things where this is not an episode where we're going to be talking about specific book recommendations per se. It's just reading's impact on us. And why it's so important, because if you think about it, it's actually one of those things that's such an unnatural thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's so good for your brain, though. And if you think about the fact that we invented this only a few thousand years ago, and it's with this invention that we actually rearranged the organization of our brain. And by doing that, we started to expand the way we think. And by doing that, we created this ability to process. We created this ability to be reshaped by experiences, and our brain like rewired itself. So this is such an unnatural thing. Speaking is natural. Reading and writing are not a natural thing for your brain to do. So I'm just super intrigued by the fact that this is something that's so unnatural, but it's so good for our brains.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, we've been speaking for millions of years and, have only been writing apparently for somewhere between 5,000 and I guess 5,600 years. That's what I encountered in my research. But I think both reading and writing hit on the same language processor in the brain. But in early development, when you're learning how to read, there's a process of decoding text that is not required when you're hearing speech. So there is definitely an extra effort on the part of our brains to interpret written language as opposed to spoken language, which I think is really interesting. And to your point, I think does make it more of a labor. I think.
Well, that's exactly right. It literally makes your brain work harder and better. It's all happening in the temporal cortex, part of the brain where you're processing things.
Yeah,
I
absolutely, man.
researched, and that's where I got that from.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, I think the the way I see it, like learning how to speak was an innovation on the part of mankind, but learning how to write was a technology in the sense that it's a tool that's external to ourselves. But obviously, most of our knowledge, I would say, is stored in written form. There are certainly civilizations with rich oral histories, but I think what has allowed us to advance so much over the last 2,000 years has been our ability to build on the written works of people before us in literature, science, math, whatever it is. I mean, obviously there's a compounding effect that comes with being able to write things down and have the next generation work on those same problems that you don't get passing down stories orally from generation to generation. So I think we have a lot to owe to the technology of writing and reading. And I think given where we are now in 2020 with all the different forms of stimulus that are on offer, reading and writing, I think are less at the forefront of people's minds. But even looking at my own life, I really didn't get into reading seriously until about 25. I'm 28 now, and I don't really. It's hard for me to pinpoint why exactly I hit an inflection point around reading at that age. But at this point, I just see it as kind of a reading, learning, thinking, writing as a portal out of the everyday. And without it, I think it would be a much more boring world to live in.
No, absolutely. And I mean, there's a lot there because I will also say I became more of an avid reader later in life than I did previously. Obviously, in my earlier life, I'd rather go kick a soccer ball around or play baseball or, go out drinking with friends, you know what I mean? And I realized like when you read books, that's where all your answers are. And so and going back to the brain again, the thing that blows my mind around this is that when you think about it, like your brain is growing, it's changing, it's creating connections, all because you're reading. I mean, even if you have to when you're reading a book, think about all the things you have to remember. You have to remember different characters, you have to remember different plots, subplots. You have to remember what's going on. And just the act of reading and what it does to your brain, to me, is just something that's so intriguing. And if earlier in your comments, I think you were kind of touching on getting to reading earlier and in life. And if you think about, there was a study that people did. They took 3 kids, they started them off in kindergarten. They told the one kid, student A, hey, you read for 20 minutes a day. They told student B to read for 5 minutes a day. And they told student C to read for 1 minute a day. So you have 3 kids reading for 25 and 1 minute apiece. And the kid who's reading for 20 minutes a day, in a year, they're going to be exposed to like 2 million words. The kid who reads for 5 minutes a day in a course of a year can be exposed to like 200,000 or 300,000 words. And the kid who's only reading for a minute a day, which again, I'm sure there are people there at one point in my life. I don't even know if I read for a minute a day, to be honest. They don't even hear 10,000 words in a year. So there's no exposure to words. You were talking about the impact of words on us. It's actually, how we also develop our speech is just on our surrounding. And so if you have parents that are using a lot of words as a kid, you're going to be exposed to more words. But going back to the children, right? So you have 3 kids. After a year, that's the number of words they're exposed to. You take that one step further. The kid who reads for 20 minutes a day, by the time they get to the 6th grade, they've already read for roughly 800 hours. The kid who reads for about 5 minutes a day, by the time they get to 6th grade, from kindergarten to 6th grade, they're going to read for about 200 to 250 hours. And the kid who read for only 1 minute per day from kindergarten to the 6th grade, which I don't think that would exist, but let's say it did, they're not even getting to 50 hours by the time they're at 6th grade. And now the reason that's so important is, again, going back to the brain. If you've done that much reading, your neurons are so connected that by the time you start to take standardized tests, the kid who read for 20 minutes a day is outpacing 90% of his or her peers. The kid who read for 5 minutes a day is outpacing, more than half of his or her peers. And the kid who read for a minute a day is in the bottom 10%. So that, to me, is the reason I am so hooked on reading, because I know the impact it has on my brain. And as we get older, I mean, it could be one of those things that just keeps us sane.
For sure. Yeah, no, I think it's really important stimulation earlier in life with respect to development, and it's a really important stimulation later in life with respect to staying sharp. I mean, I think you hit on an important point earlier in your comments around building a vocabulary, and I think the more words that you have to describe the world with, and the richer your vocabulary, the more things you can literally think about. Like take a word like rueful, for example. I didn't know what rueful meant, and I encountered it in a book I was reading, and it means to experience humor in a sorrowful way. And like I never thought about rueful, RUEFUL,
and it means what?
To laugh or experience humor in a sorrowful way.
Sorrowful.
Okay. And it's I don't think a word that's used very frequently, but that word alone opened me up to the idea that you can experience humor in a sorrowful way. Like you can, after a bad day, the way you might laugh self-deprecatingly is different than the way you'll laugh at something if you're on a high. So I think, not only does, vocab make you a better communicator, but I think it allows you to see the world in higher resolution, because, you're able to just think about a wider spectrum of human experiences and think about, different dimensions that you wouldn't necessarily be thinking in with a more limited vocabulary.
And imagine if you say the right thing to the right person at the right time.
For sure.
Because you have an expansive vocabulary, you're able to impress someone, and now all of a sudden you find yourself in the situation that's a lot better than maybe the one that you currently were in, just based off your ability to say the right thing at the right time to the right people. And it's interesting because I think, well, let me ask you a question. Like, what kind of books do you read? Are you reading more fiction? Are you reading more nonfiction? Or do you think you're having a balance of the two?
I think it's probably a decent balance of the two. I think I have a greater affinity for nonfiction than fiction. But if I do find fiction that I really like, I usually go through it really fast. But when I'm reading fiction that I don't enjoy, it's a slog, because at least, if you're reading nonfiction, even if you're not that into it, you feel like it's productive reading. You feel like maybe you're getting some information out of it that will serve you later. But if you're reading a fictional book that you don't enjoy, there's not a whole lot of ROI there. So yeah. But how about you?
Agreed, man. But I would say that I'm pretty heavy on the nonfiction side of things, just because, again, I love facts, I love stats, I love different perspectives. I just love knowing it's real, quote unquote, maybe sometimes. But I feel like when it comes to the fiction, same with you. If it's a good fiction, I'm good with it. I can go through it. But if it's one that's just like, it feels like it's a waste of my time, then I'd rather be reading something else. But I think actually, again, the reason I asked that question is because I was, just curious about my reading patterns. And I realized that one thing you could learn if you actually read more fiction, especially maybe earlier in life, is to be more empathetic with people, because a fiction book will take you through different characters and different experiences that you don't have to live through yourself. But because you read about it, you may be able to adapt to that situation a little bit better in real life. And so, like, having that empathy and having that understanding of different characters going through different things based off what you read, maybe that gives you the ability to then react, in an appropriate way, right?
For sure.
It's like, yeah, I'd rather be spending my time on nonfiction, but I think that's, if I had kids, I would tell my kids, make sure you have a balance at the very least, because of that empathy factor on the fiction side.
For sure. Yeah, no, I think fiction can definitely help people think more empathetically, because it's really the only opportunity you're allowed to put yourself in the first person of someone that's from a different walk of life than you. You can hear about someone from a different walk of life to you. You can hear about their life in face-to-face conversation, but it's still a sort of subject-object relationship. But when you're reading a fiction book, assuming it's written in the first person, you're really dropped into their life and experiencing their world as they are. And I think that, opens doors in your mind that maybe even real life conversations with other people can't. It really taps into a certain imagination and a certain empathy, especially if it's the very talented writer.
Yeah. Now, speaking of empathy, it's like, what are your thoughts on, okay, so you're talking about books can improve vocabulary. Obviously, hand in hand with that, they can improve overall knowledge. So now, how do you feel about the ability of books being able to transport you to different eras? I think that's one of those things that is something you don't really think about, but it's so true. And I actually heard this on another podcast where the guest talked about how you can be put in a different era. Like, you don't have to have lived 100 years ago to know what happened 100 years ago. And when you have information at your fingertips, you're more equipped to have conversations. So let's say you're 20, 22 years old and I'll just flash back to my personal experiences, right? And so I had a previous career in financial services, and I graduated college in 2008. Obviously, not a good time to be graduating, let alone not a good time to be graduating with a finance degree. But one of those things is I missed having quote unquote experience during the crash of 2008 just by chance, just because of when I was born, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I used to get a question of where were you in 2008, as if like I didn't have experience, and because I only read about it and heard stories from other people, like I didn't have experience there. But what are your thoughts on being able to transport to a different era and building credibility off of that just because you read about it?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you absolutely can, build credibility by reading about a different time or a different, or a certain event that you may not have been alive for. I think it obviously comes down to your ability to retain that information and produce it in conversation. So, we formerly worked at an asset manager. We neither of us were in the industry during the tech bubble at the turn of the millennia. But I think if you can read a book about that and really internalize it and
Yeah.
be able to, to speak to the feelings and the sort of zeitgeist of that time with an advisor, with a client on the phone, I think you can definitely build credibility and show a certain perspective that belies your age. I think people definitely respect that, because I don't think there's a lot of appetite for, there's so much going on now. I don't think there's a whole lot of appetite for learning about the crises of yesteryear. But
Yeah.
I think older generations would probably look forward to having a conversation with a young person that's well versed on something they weren't alive for, but was important to that older generation.
Yeah, and I mean, you fast forward in the future, there's going to be a point in time where people start to ask a next generation of where were you during the pandemic? And I simply think that this is an opportune time for people to really think about how they're rebranding themselves, what they're doing to be better, what are they doing with their close relationships. And I feel like reading can help you with that. Reading can provide gratitude. Reading can inspire you. Reading can help you relate to people. I mean, if you think about, like, if I ever met Joe Rogan, I would immediately know what to talk to him simply because of his interest in the Comanche Indian tribe. I started reading books on them, and I would know that I could spend 20 minutes with Joe just talking about the Comanche Indians. And it just is one of those things where, if you think about that question, where were you during the pandemic? It's like, okay, I may not have had experience, but I did enough things to build this overall knowledge base that I'm ready to share with the world.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely, man. Absolutely. I think you hit the point about Joe Rogan as well. I think being able to sort of being able to express an alignment of interest by reading the same books and having a dialogue about that shared set of information is really a nice way to bring two people together. Especially, I mean, even beyond nonfiction, I think if you find someone else that has read the same fiction as you and really enjoys it, there's a certain
Yeah.
affinity there that's even deeper than like finding someone that likes the same music than you or the same movies, because books are so multi-dimensional, and I think tastes are so varied that if you find someone who really enjoys the same types of books you read, there's fertile ground there for a friendship or relationship.
Have you ever gifted a book to somebody?
um you know what? I have not. I've been gifted more books than I probably deserve, and I think it's probably time for me to return the favor. Uh, but yeah, no, that's a good reminder. Have you gifted a book to somebody?
Only once. It was like years ago. The book was The Secret. I don't know. Like,
Yeah,
do you
yeah,
know that
yeah,
book, right?
yeah.
It's like a
Sure, yeah.
wellness book.
Conor McGregor promoted it for a little while, I think.
Oh, did he? I'm not sure
Yeah,
about
yeah.
that. But anyway, I mean, there's you can get some really good information out of books. So anyway, I gifted it to somebody. I have no idea what happened since, but it's all good.
Yeah.
No, he was a
Yeah.
good friend. I don't know what happened to the book, but I know what happened to him.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah, he's a good friend, and we actually still stay in touch. He was actually at my wedding, so yeah, it's all good there. But I have no idea where that book is.
Yo, so what's your what is your thinking about, this is maybe a little bit of a sidebar, but about like recommending books or recommending podcasts? Because obviously, people are busy now. Reading a 250-page book or listening to a 3-hour podcast is a pretty major investment of time. I mean, I think you want to share what you're learning with other people, not only to kind of have a richer conversation, but um, you know, put them onto information that you think may benefit their own life. So I think, when we recommend things to other people, it is coming from a good place. But what are your thoughts about how to do that thoughtfully in a time when there's so much content out there and people's time is so squeezed?
Yes, I definitely agree with time being squeezed. As it relates to recommendations, you can be specific with a person if you know the person, but then you can also recommend generally as well. So I'll give an example. So just given the context of, you know, what's happened with Black Lives Matter and the result of that whole energy and people being a little bit more aware of some of their biases, you can recommend a book like Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People. And in a time of social unrest, that applies to everyone. But I'm currently reading a book called Molly's Game by Molly Bloom. And I feel like I would recommend it to people simply because people are looking for books, but I would specifically recommend it to some of the people I know who like to play poker. Like I know they would really, really love this book because it's a super cool story of a 26-year-old woman who ends up running the most exclusive, massive underground high stakes poker game in the world. And it's real.
Yep.
And so I think when you recommend, you have to have an energy behind it. You have to explain why it had an impact on you. And like, if I recommend it to some of my poker buddies, I would imagine they would actually carve out the time to read it just because of the energy that I had in delivering the recommendation.
Yep. For sure. For sure.
How do you go about it? And I know
Yeah.
I
No.
didn't touch on the podcast thing. We can talk about that part
For
of the question
sure.
later, but for books, how do you go about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're going to give a book to someone, knowing that it could take them 5 or 6 hours to go through it, or however long it takes them, based on how fast they read, I think you want there to be thought and you want there to be intention behind it. And I think you, to some extent, need to accept that they may not get to it like next week. Like,
Right.
have some sort of leniency around the timeline there. But I'm totally with you. I mean, I guess I bring it up because I think there's, people are constantly sharing different podcasts and different books, and if people know you really well, typically those are welcome recommendations. But I just think it's a different world now than it was 20 years ago, in the sense that there's so much out there to share, and you can't get to everything. So
That's true.
I guess that's what I'm trying to hit on.
That's
I
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and no, dude. I mean, there's so much information coming our way. I mean, we're taking in 5, maybe 10 times as much information as we did 40 years ago. I don't know, 50 years ago. I can't imagine, how many newspapers there were back then versus the amount of news that's out right now, right? It's like almost tenfold the amount of newspapers, if you want to call it newspapers, right? But our brains, again, going back to the brain, we're not set up to take in all this information. Like we're not set up to process the amount that's coming to us. We can only process 120 bits per second. And if you think about a conversation with just two people, that takes up almost 60 bits. So like by the time a third person enters a conversation and starts talking, it becomes really difficult to pay attention to everything or anything. And so, yeah, you
Mhm.
are totally right that there's an influx of information, and our brain is just not equipped to process it. But imagine when we get to the point where we can process all this information, and I think people are getting better at processing. I mean, like Elon processes pretty well. And there, I think, are ways to improve your processing, like eating better, sleeping more, or more appropriately, meditating, exercising, spending time with loved ones. I think those are ways where you can increase your ability to process things. But um, yeah, that we might have just gone on a tangent with that, but I just think there's something to be said about the amount of information and the fact that our brain we haven't adapted yet.
For sure. Yeah, no, and I think that is why it's such a worthy project to sit down with a book, because especially a hardcover book, because the only stimulation available to you is what words are in between the two covers. You compare that to, you can compare an hour of reading a hardcover book to or a paperback, whatever it may be, to like an hour on the internet, and the
Night and day.
internet really will take you, yeah, wherever your mind wants to go. I mean, like you look at your search history, it's so discursive relative to what the experience would be sitting down and reading a single book. You can read 40 different news articles in an hour, or watch some combination of podcasts, YouTube videos, news articles, whatever it may be, in that same period of time. And you have to ask yourself, did you really sink your teeth into any one of those items? Are you really
Right.
walking away retaining any new information, or are you just sort of being buffeted around by your mind, manifesting on your screen? But with a book, there's you're really required to engage the material at a really deep level, especially when you're, especially I should say, reading relative to listening. The way I think about it, if you're listening to a YouTube video or listening to a podcast, or listening to the TV, it's kind of like a treadmill. Like you can be running on the treadmill and getting exercise, but sometimes your feet are on either side of the treadmill. It's just kind of running past you and doing the work for you. Like, is the difference between hearing and actually actively listening. But with a book, the treadmill is not, there's no treadmill there. Like, you're running on the street. If you're not reading, you're not going to get through the book. But you can play an audio book. You play a 3-hour audio book and get through it. And there's it's kind of the level of information that you take away is dependent on your level of engagement with it. With the book, there's just no crutch. So you have to put the work in if you want to get through the book. So I think it's a very different sort of it's a very different experience than listening or hearing.
Yeah, but what would you say to the person who says, I'm more of an audio learner?
Well, no, I mean, I think honestly, like, I think you can, I guess they've done the studies. People that are actively listening to audio can remember just as much from the content as people that read that same content. So I would say, if you're actually actively engaged with it, by all
Yeah.
means, like, go ahead. There's not, I mean, to be like a reading snob, but I think that, it is hard, given how discursive our own minds are, to stay fully engaged in like a 2-hour podcast from minute 1 to minute 120. And there are, I would imagine, for most people, gaps in their attention throughout that. But if you have that same kind of mind wandering when you're reading a book, you'll realize, I didn't get, oh my God, I've been zoning out this past paragraph. I have to go back and read the whole thing. And I guess they actually, they've done studies, in 10% of the time we spend reading, they've tracked our eyes, and it's actually spent with that 10% is our eyes retracing the same words. So we're constantly kind of
Wow.
going back and recalibrating and making sure we didn't miss anything. But with an audiobook, you don't really have that same experience. Yeah, you can rewind, but I think for the most part, people just let it run.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't even think about that. And like that's happening without us even realizing it. Like, I don't necessarily remember really having my eyes go back and sometimes, but no, that's interesting because it's so true. And I think that's a great one of those things about having the book in front of you, but I don't necessarily have to have a book. I'm more of a Kindle guy. I'll tell you that moving to Kindle is what really boosted my level of reading. It's just I was sick and tired of like lugging a book. Looking at a book can look heavy, bro. Like it becomes heavy to pick up sometimes. But if you have a Kindle and, you know, shout out to them for just kind of gamifying the page turning process. Or I've just been reading some page turners. I don't know. But I'll tell you that ever since I made the switch to Kindle, my level of reading has gone exponentially higher. And I think maybe people can relate to that. But yo, you mentioned um, like not being present necessarily when it's on audio and kind of tuning out. But that also has like implications in the larger scheme of life. If you think about how much people are just tuning out half their lives, man. They think they were there for the experience, but were they actually there for the experience? Like if I read this the other day, it's like if you were drinking a cup of coffee and for that cup of coffee, half the time you were thinking about what happened yesterday. Were you actually there to drink the cup of coffee? And then if you multiply that times like the amount of different activities that could happen over a week and then a month and then a year and then a lifetime, it's like, dude, have you been checked out half of your life thinking that you were actually there the whole time?
For sure. For sure. No, I think for many people the answer is yes. I mean, I think we have, with our imagination uh, as a species, a pretty unique ability to travel to different places and different times, both the past and the future without ever leaving the room, the chair we're sitting in. And you think about something like anxiety. I mean, anxiety, at least when I think about my own anxiety, it usually manifests in like replaying past events that I didn't think go well, or trying
Mm-hmm.
to plan for a stressful event in the future and kind of scenario testing different simulations there. And to your point, all of that requires you being somewhere else other than where you are right now. And I think that's the benefit of meditation. It forces you to learn how to exist only in the space that you're presently in. And I think what you find is, like, obviously there are people where this is unfortunately not true for, but if you're very present in the actual moment you're currently occupying, life isn't really that bad, or certainly not as stressful or as anxiety provoking as it seems when you're either living in the past or living in the future. And I think, like meditation, I think reading offers that, in the sense that, yeah,
Exactly.
you are sort of being transported to another world, but you're not. You're kind of, you're doing that in a deliberate way. Like you're time traveling, or traveling to another location in the context of this moment. Like, you're taking advantage of this moment in a very deliberate, intentional way to go somewhere else, instead of letting your anxiety push you in different directions.
Exactly. And that's why reading can be a form of meditation. It literally makes you sit down and take in what's going on that page in that moment. Um, and imagine if you're reading The Power of Now, realizing the power of this moment. It's like it hits you
Yeah,
when you read books like that. It literally can move you when you read things like that. That's a pretty highly recommended book, The Power of Now. I don't know if you've read it,
nice.
but
No, I haven't.
super. Oh yeah, by Eckhart Tolle or
Yeah.
Tolle. And yeah, man, you mentioned some of the words. It's like you had read it. That's why I brought it up. Around, you can't really think about tomorrow or the next moment, and you can't think about what just happened. Just being right here, and that takes practice. And maybe one of the ways of doing that is through reading. But if you
For
were to
sure.
recommend, sorry, go ahead. I was gonna say if
Yeah,
you were
yeah,
gonna,
no, yeah. There you go ahead. Floor is yours.
oh, good. No, dude, I was just gonna say if you were to recommend something, what would you recommend right now?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, I did recommend Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth to you by Douglas Harding
Yes.
early in the
Yes.
spring. Pretty dense read, but if you are on a very deliberate sort of inquiry into your own spirituality, I would highly recommend that book. I could only read about 10 pages at a time because it was so dense. It's by Douglas Harding, who is an English mystic. I encountered him through Sam Harris's podcast and Sam Harris's Waking Up app. But I found it a very, very fruitful read, and I think it's hard to it's hard to synthesize his argument because it was so rich. But I think what it opened up to me was that there is room for both, scientific rationalism and an acceptance that we'll never entirely understand what existence or what life is, or what the origins of the universe are. So to be a purely materialist, to be a purely rationalist, that's excessive in one way, and obviously to be dogmatic in a religious sense is sort of an excess on the other side. But there's room to live a rational, spiritually fulfilled life by sort of finding something in the middle. And it's, it may sound mild, it may sound trite, but I challenge you to read that book because it was honestly one of the most mind-bending reads I've ever experienced.
The challenge with a capital C, I'm about 20% of the way through it. And to your point, I mean, it's a few pages at a time, because he does get you to the point where you're going to see yourself in a lot of different ways, possibly. Um, and it's one of those things where once you start to realize like how close you can get to actually understanding it is exactly when you don't understand it.
Exactly. That's well said, man. That's exactly it. Yeah. The once you start to be kind of overcome with awe and confusion is the very moment where you start to think you're finally understanding his point. It's yeah. I would read that book at night and uh, go for a walk outside afterward and look up at the sky, and it was just like he had completely turned my perspective around, but just really, I guess, brightened my perspective and my appreciation of us, Earth, our solar system, how it's nested in the galaxy. I mean, he really is able to articulate express the oneness of everything in a really, really unique capacity. And I don't think, regardless of where you are spiritually now, if you can get through it and understand it, I don't think you'll find anything particularly objectionable, regardless of where you are, which is really cool. He had C.S. Lewis wrote the foreword, who, was a devout Christian, famous author, and he endorsed it. He thought it was a really compelling read, which I think says a lot. So I was coming from the other end. I was not, a devout Christian going into it, but I think if, both a devout Christian and a skeptic like myself can find meaning in it, it's a worthy read.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing I would say, on the backs of that recommendation and on the backs of your comments leading up into it, I think that is one of the benefits of reading that you don't get through like listening to a podcast or listening to like a short form YouTube video. Like, the idea, I think there's a little bit of a life hack culture around, in our generation, the feeling that you can really change your life or change your thinking with a very potent 10-minute inspirational video. But like the amount that you'll get out of an inquiry is commensurate with the amount that you put into it. And like, you're not going to really fundamentally reorder your perspective if that's what you're going for by watching a 10-minute YouTube video. Like, it's just not going to happen. But people do attest to books fundamentally changing their life, and I think that's because books are can be a major investment of time and a major investment of mental energy, and for that reason they do really have the capacity to alter people's thinking in meaningful and in lasting ways.
Yeah, and because maybe it's going back to what's going on in your brain as you're reading, you're literally rewiring. So if
Yes,
it's more of a permanent thing, so it becomes a life-changing experience for some people because you've literally rewired the part of your brain that's processing. As opposed to if you just watch a video, you're not necessarily rewiring your brain from like a neuron's perspective. And that deep-rooted change is what, then you can evolve your behavior based off of what you read, I think, in a more permanent way than if I just ride the momentum of the last YouTube motivational video I saw.
for sure. Yeah, no. Sorry, do you have more?
No, I was just going to say it kind of goes to like one thing, and this is a little bit off track, but like
Sure.
the difference between having a motivation and then understanding your why. Like I could be motivated all day long, but like if I don't have a why, I'm not going to necessarily do what I'm motivated about. So if I'm, trying to get a workout in or something, like I know I want to live a healthier life for myself, my family, my future family. So that's the why of when I want to work out. And so like I can watch a motivational video and then because I have a why, I can go work out. But if I don't have that purpose or that reason, like I can watch the motivational video and it has zero impact on me. So a little bit of a
Yeah,
sidebar, but just to, I wanted to just touch on that because
for
it's a
sure.
thought that I was thinking.
Do you think that you always have the why in advance of pursuing the right content to motivate you towards that why, or do you think sometimes you can encounter new information that actually shapes the why itself?
Yeah, the latter, man. I think I'm a big believer that like you can have multiple shifts in perspective, and a lot of that can just be developed based on the journey that you're taking. So your journey is teaching you these things. So you don't necessarily have to have your why into going into everything. I think that's not natural. Um,
Yeah,
but just in this one particular easy to share example of like exercising, like motivation is one thing, having a reason and a purpose behind why you do it is what actually causes you to take the action. So anyway, I know we kind of digressed there, but going back to your brain, the neurons getting rewired, that's why reading can have a huge impact on you lifetime, like on a lifetime perspective. I totally agree with you on that.
for sure. Yeah, and I think continuing on that point, your point around rewiring and reconfiguring your brain, I think going through a long form book, there's more opportunities for the tumblers to kind of fall in succession. Like if you're trying to really understand an argument, I think let's say nonfiction. So say that someone's advocating some political or philosophical position. I think you naturally have a lot of subconscious doubts or rebuttals with respect to the position when you go into it, but if over the course of 250 or 300 pages they can slowly start to address all those, then you really have that kind of comprehensive rewiring where your doubt and your skepticism kind of slowly unwinds. And if you read a short news article or read a short article on Medium, you can be like, oh well, there's some good points there, but part of me still is skeptical, or I think that there's some grift there. I don't believe uh I'm unpersuaded. But if you get through a whole book on a given
Yeah.
topic and you still
Yeah.
disagree with the author, then
Yeah.
maybe you must know a ton about the topic, or they really are coming from a place of bad faith, and it's a trash book. But I think if you read an entire book written by someone that's of a different opinion than you, chances are it will open up your thinking and make some kind of shift, even if it's a modest one.
Oh man, so you describing that like reminds me of the experience I had when I read Blitzed. It's a book about the drugs in the Third Reich back in the Nazi days. And okay, so the reason what you said strikes a chord is because I remember when I read that, I was like, oh my God, when I was learning about Hitler and World War II, and I'm sitting there in the history room, like history class, right? It's like seventh, eighth, ninth grade, whatever it was. They're showing us videos, and Hitler looks like he's super passionate, like he's getting people riled up. And then you realize when you read the book Blitzed that it was because he was just like hopped up on a bunch of drugs, and like he had his own personal doctor that just kept feeding him meth, and like the whole Nazi regime was on a bunch of drugs that kept them up for 17, 18 hours at a time. That's how Blitzkrieg actually happened. They were all on drugs. When you realize that, you're like, holy moly, my perspective has definitely shifted. Because imagine if that like seventh, eighth, or ninth grade teacher was like, you know what, the reason he's talking that fast, or the reason everyone's moving that quick, or the reason Blitzkrieg actually occurred and they could go that far that long without any breaks and just go on just straight through, was because they were all on drugs. Now imagine if you knew that back then. It would change your life of how you looked at those videos. At least it did for me. So
For sure, yeah.
if you're looking for one book that actually will change your perspective on things, it's Blitzed, Drugs in the Third Reich. And it's just one of those fun, interesting reads around history and what really happened.
That's a good tip. Well, what are your, I mean, with respect to the people that are in your circle, how much reading do you think is going on? How much of a passion is there among your circle of friends, or maybe your family members? Because I know it spans multiple generations. I'm curious what the makeup of readers look like in your circle.
Interesting. I never thought about it from the generational perspective. I feel like like family wise,
Sure.
I feel like my parents read a decent amount. I think my dad reads more than my mom. Like, not to put that out there, but whatever.
Yeah.
How do I know that actually? You know what I mean? Just based off conversations I have. But
Yeah.
anyway, so, but I would say that, yeah, reading in my circle does occur. I think I am surrounded by people that do read a lot. I know I am. I mean, my wife reads a lot. And so we'll actually spend just like some nights just like reading. There's like no TV on, you know what
Nice.
I mean? Yeah, but I've never really had this conversation with like the periphery about their reading engagements and stuff like that. Cause like, I think that's a personal thing, man. It's like, I don't want to judge anyone for not reading. Like, who am I to do that? And I'm just saying I enjoy reading. So just because I enjoy it doesn't mean other people have to enjoy it. And quite frankly, they could be doing something that I don't do, or like even know how to do. Like, maybe they're playing the guitar. I don't know how to play the guitar. I would love to learn how to play the guitar, but oh well, you know what I mean? I'll pass on that skill. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think just on like my immediate circle, I do have readers around me, but I have no idea about what other people are doing. And hopefully, my hope is that they are, just based off all the things that we've talked about, like the impact on your brain, how it can help you in certain situations, how it can help you, find gratitude. It can get you through, it can inspire you. If you're reading something like Shoe Dog and you realize Phil Knight and his journey of Nike and how he started, selling just racing shoes in Japan, and then over the course of time turn that into the Nike operation that we know, and the ups and downs. So if you're an entrepreneur, you pick up that book, you feel absolutely inspired that you can get your idea not only on the table but actually execute. So I think that hopefully people are using books to an advantage like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I brought it up as kind of a segue into some research I gathered from Pew
Yeah,
around
hit me with some facts,
yeah,
JB.
yeah, absolutely, man. These are not my facts, but
Stats,
yeah. All right, so 74% of Americans have read at least one book in any format in the past 12 months. That was in 2018, which
That's, I think,
I
higher
thought
than
was
most.
actually what's that?
I thought it'd be a lower number.
I thought it'd be a way lower number too, man. I mean, one book is not necessarily a lot, but still, the fact that 3/4 of America is reading, has interest in reading, I thought was actually pretty encouraging.
I love
Um,
that.
yeah, yeah, and let's see, nearly a quarter of younger adults, those aged 18 to 29, said they've listened to an audiobook in the past year. I think that's pretty unsurprising. That was up from 16% in 2016. And
Dude, I mean, the more people that listen to Joe Rogan, the more people are going to be listening to audiobooks.
yeah,
He
do you,
loves that,
that's an interesting point.
and I think he touts it. And I love this guy, man. I'm a big fan, so I'm not hating at all. I'm just saying because he's doing it, you're going to see an increase in that number.
For sure. And I think people, both with the kind of podcasting boon here and the audiobook boon, I think a lot of that is tied to people realizing they can make productive use of time now in ways they didn't have before. Like they're finding, an hour or 2 hours in their day now to be productive where they couldn't be prior to that technology. You can listen to an audiobook while you're washing the dishes. You can listen to an audiobook on the way to work, on the way home from work, while you're working out. It's such an opportunity to maximize your productivity and get the most out of your time. I think if you try to do it all day, it can be a little bit of an overload. And going back to the earlier part of the conversation, I think you can start to tune out. But if you do it like anything in moderation, I think you can learn a lot more than you could have in years prior to this technology really taking form.
Yeah, totally. What other? I know you were going to say some other stats.
Yeah, so 4 in 10 Americans say they read only print books, which I get. I don't. It didn't surprise me too much. 3 in 10 read both print and digital, and fewer than 7% read only digital formats. I think that number will grow a lot. I think. Kindle I think is more cost effective than in paperback. I think it's obviously more efficient in terms of space in your house. You imagine if all the books that you read on Kindle over the last few years were paperbacks, you'd probably have to build a new shelf for them, I would imagine.
I was just going to say, dude, the new age bookshelf is going to have one thing on it. It's going to have the Kindle.
Nice. Yeah, exactly, dude. Exactly. I do like their user interface where you can look at your library and they actually, make it they actually do kind of a illustration of a shelf with the titles. I think that I don't know. There's something I think maybe it's just a function of growing up around paperback and hard copy books, but I think there's a certain place in my heart for that sort of vision of the library with the knowledge between actual physical pages. I don't know, there's something there that I have a certain sentimentality for. So I'm glad that Kindle is playing on that, at least digitally.
Absolutely, man. Wow, we can just continue to go on that because there is this special joy of like going back in the day. Remember going to the library and like finding your book, picking it from the shelf, like that, all that process and that action like brought a certain level of joy. You flip the pages, you're like, I'm here. You're like, I'm at the library. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, totally. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I know. It's I think maybe part of it had to do with it was like a quiet space. I think there was maybe a large part of it did have to do with the fact that it was quiet, but the library felt very much like a sacred space, like especially for someone that didn't spend a lot of time, too much time in church growing up. I mean, we went on Sundays when I was younger, but I don't know. I think it's important to have sacred spaces in communities and sacred institutions, and I feel like the library is still one of them, albeit it's a secular one, but I think people, I would hope, still have a certain level of reverence for the space when they walk into a library. At
Dude,
least that's how it was when I was growing up.
yeah, the last time I
Yeah.
went to a library was last Friday, and it was to go get a COVID test, bro.
Oh no. Oh God. Wow.
Not because I have any symptoms or anything like that, but because I think it's a responsibility to know if you carry or whatever, and so that you're not spreading it. But I'm just saying, like, now you go to the library for that.
I know it is a
But
different year for sure. It is a
yeah,
very different year. Why did they? Do you know why they had it there of all places?
it was in the parking lot. I mean, it wasn't in the actual library. It was just in the parking lot. You drive up, they check you in. You go to a next station where people that are covered up, they come over to your window, they verify your name on a vial, and they do a little cotton swab of your nose. It takes like 3 seconds in each nostril, and then I'll find out in like a week.
Wow. So, and that was a test for whether or not you currently have it, or was it an antibody test?
No, if I have it, yeah.
Oh,
So
I have
they're
it. Got it.
testing to see if I have it. And again, not to scare anyone who may be listening, but it was more of a precaution, and I think the right thing to do.
Yeah, for sure, man. Yeah, I'm entertaining doing the same thing. I guess part of me was freaked out, or not freaked out, but uh, discouraged from it because I was worried that going to a testing facility may put me at greater risk, being around other people that potentially have it. But it sounds like they're being pretty smart about it.
Yeah, you're in your car, and when we went, we legit were the only ones in line. And I know that that's a rarity considering what's going on across other parts of California and Texas, for example, where lines are really long. We just got maybe lucky with our time slot. But yeah, it's super safe.
Nice, nice.
Yeah, man. But we're coming up on an hour. Let's wrap this bad boy up.
Well, I think it was a pretty interesting conversation. I enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, absolutely, dude. I look forward to the next one. And if you are listening, we simply want to say thank you for your time. If you can follow us, subscribe to our podcast, the Rising Laterally podcast, that would be great. And again, this is our second episode. We are going to be doing this on a weekly basis. And if you have any topics that you want to engage with, let us know on our website, risinglaterally.com. But until then, let's take care of each other. Be easy.
Take care.
Peace.